Let me talk to you for a moment. Not like a lecture, not like a theory, but like someone who's been there. Have you ever noticed how the kindest people don't break loudly? They go quiet. And that silence, that's where things get dangerous. Carl Jung once said that what we ignore in ourselves doesn't disappear, it waits. And when an empath finally gets fed up, that waiting ends. This isn't about becoming heartless, it's about waking up. In this video, I'm going to show you why a fed-up empath becomes more ruthless than any narcissist ever imagined, not through revenge, but through clarity. The kind of clarity that cuts access, ends cycles, and never explains itself again. Stay till the end, because one part of this might change how you see your own silence. And if this feels like I'm speaking to you, not at you, subscribe and stay with me. Drop a comment too. I don't see comments as clicks, I see them as conversations we were finally brave enough to start. When we talk about an empath finally reaching their limit, we're not talking about anger in the usual sense. We're talking about something far deeper, something Carl Jung explained through his idea of the shadow. Jung believed that every human being has parts of themselves they hide, suppress, or deny, not because those parts are evil, but because they were never accepted, encouraged, or allowed to exist. For empaths, this shadow often contains traits like assertiveness, anger, firmness, and self-prioritization. From a young age, many empaths learn that being loved means being understanding, forgiving, patient, and emotionally available at all times. So they push the other traits down. They tell themselves that setting boundaries is selfish, that saying no is cruel, that expressing anger makes them bad. Over time, this constant suppression creates an inner imbalance. The empath appears gentle and accommodating on the outside, but inside, the shadow is growing, quietly watching, learning, waiting. And this is where people misunderstand what happens when an empath gets fed up. They assume the empath suddenly turns cold or changes, but in reality, the empath is not becoming something new, they're becoming whole. Jung didn't believe healing meant staying light and good. He believed healing meant integration. When the empath finally integrates their shadow, they don't lose their kindness, they gain strength. They stop explaining themselves. They stop absorbing emotional damage in the name of love. They stop negotiating their worth. And to people who benefited from the empath's self-sacrifice, especially narcissists, this feels ruthless. But it isn't cruelty, it's balance. The empath who integrates their shadow learns how to be calm and firm, compassionate and unreachable, understanding and unmovable. They no longer react emotionally to manipulation because their shadow now provides boundaries where there used to be guilt. Jung warned that what we refuse to face within ourselves eventually controls us from the outside. For years, empaths are controlled by fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of being misunderstood. But once the shadow awakens, those fears lose their grip. The empath realizes that their suppressed anger was never destructive, it was informative. It was telling them where lines were crossed, where respect was missing, where love had turned into obligation. When this realization happens, the shift is internal first. The empath doesn't announce it, they don't threaten, they don't seek revenge, they simply withdraw access. Their energy becomes grounded, not reactive. Their words become fewer, but more precise. Their presence changes. And this is exactly why narcissists are caught off guard. Narcissists rely on emotional predictability, on guilt, empathy, and over-explaining. They know how to provoke tears, apologies, and self-doubt. But they don't know how to deal with an empath who has integrated their shadow, because that empath no longer needs validation or approval to feel whole. Jung believed that true psychological power comes from knowing yourself fully, not just your light, but your darkness too. A fed-up empath has done that work, often painfully and quietly. They have faced the parts of themselves they were taught to reject and realized those parts were never the enemy. The result is emotional authority, not dominance, not control, authority, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, the kind that walks away without hatred. To the outside world, this looks like emotional detachment. To the empath, it feels like relief, like standing upright after years of bending. The shadow awakening doesn't make the empath ruthless in a violent or malicious way. It makes them immune to manipulation. And to those who thrived on their emotional availability, that immunity feels devastating. Jung understood that wholeness is threatening to those who depend on fragmentation. When the empath integrates their shadow, they stop being a source of emotional supply and start being a complete individual. That's the real transformation. Not a loss of softness, but the addition of strength. Not the death of empathy, but the end of self-betrayal. And once that door closes, it doesn't slam. It locks quietly, permanently, and without regret. One of the most painful, yet liberating shifts that happens when an empath becomes fed up is the moment they stop projecting goodness onto people who have never earned it. And this is something Carl Jung spoke about with striking clarity through his concept of projection. Jung believed that projection happens when we place our own inner qualities, our kindness, honesty, empathy, and potential onto others, especially when we don't fully recognize or value those traits within ourselves. For empaths, projection often feels like hope. They look at someone who is inconsistent, manipulative, or emotionally unavailable and say, they're not bad, they're just wounded, or if I love them enough, they'll change. What's really happening is that the empath is seeing their own capacity for growth, care, and depth, and assuming it exists in the other person too. This isn't foolishness, it's empathy without boundaries. But over time, this habit becomes deeply damaging. The empath keeps giving chances not because the other person is changed, but because the empath believes in who they could be. Jung warned that projection blinds us to reality. It replaces truth with fantasy. And nowhere is this more dangerous than in relationships with narcissistic personalities, who instinctively exploit this tendency. Narcissists don't correct projections, they feed them. They mirror just enough kindness, vulnerability, or charm to keep the empath invested, while never truly embodying the values being projected onto them. For a long time, the empath lives in emotional confusion, constantly trying to reconcile the person they believe in with the behavior they keep experiencing. This creates self-doubt. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe if I explain better, they'll understand. But the turning point comes when the empath finally gets tired. Not just tired of being hurt, but tired of lying to themselves. This is when projection begins to collapse. The empath starts to observe instead of interpret. They listen to actions instead of excuses. They notice patterns instead of promises. And this shift is quiet, but it's radical. The empath realizes that what they were calling potential was never evidence. It was imagination fueled by their own goodness. Jung believed that reclaiming projections is a crucial step towards psychological maturity. When empaths reclaim their projection, they take their kindness back. They stop handing it out as proof that others are good. They understand, maybe for the first time, that empathy does not require self-sacrifice. This clarity feels ruthless to those who benefited from the empath's blindness. Suddenly, emotional manipulation stops working. Guilt trips fall flat. Victim stories lose their power. The empath no longer feels responsible for fixing, saving, or understanding someone who consistently causes harm. And the most unsettling part for the narcissist is that this change doesn't come with anger, it comes with neutrality. The empath doesn't argue or accuse, they simply adjust their access. Jung understood that seeing clearly is more threatening than confrontation. When you argue, you still engage. When you explain, you still hope. But when projection ends, hope ends too. Not hope for life, but hope that this particular person will become something they've shown no capacity to be. That's why this clarity feels so cold to outsiders. The empath is no longer emotionally invested in who the narcissist pretends to be. They are responding to who they actually are. And that honesty is devastating to someone who relies on illusion. The empath doesn't need revenge because clarity removes the need for it. They don't need closure because understanding replaces confusion. They don't need validation because they're no longer questioning their perception. Jung believed that growth often feels like loss because we grieve the fantasies we once lived by. For empaths, letting go of projection can feel like mourning, not the person, but the future they imagined. Yet on the other side of that grief is emotional freedom. The empath no longer gives their light to people who use it to hide their darkness. They reserve their empathy for those who can meet it with respect. This is why a fed-up empath appears ruthless, not because they've lost compassion, but because they've stopped wasting it. They no longer confuse understanding with tolerance. They no longer confuse love with endurance. And once projection is gone, manipulation has nowhere to land. The empath isn't hardened, they're awake. And that awakening, rooted in clear perception rather than emotional fantasy, is one of the most powerful psychological shifts Jung ever described. There comes a moment in an empath's life that feels quiet on the outside, but irreversible on the inside. And Carl Jung described this moment through his concept of individuation. Jung believed that individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are, not who you were conditioned to be in order to survive, be accepted, or be loved. For empaths, this process is especially intense because much of their identity is built around attachment, being needed, being understanding, being the emotional safe place for others. From early on, many empaths learn that their value comes from how much they give, how much they tolerate, and how well they can hold space for other people's pain. Over time, this creates a deep pattern of overgiving, where attachment becomes more important than self-respect. Jung would say that this is not wholeness, it's fragmentation. Parts of the self, needs, limits, anger, autonomy, are pushed aside to maintain connection. Individuation begins the moment the empath starts feeling the cost of this pattern. Not just emotional exhaustion, but a quiet realization that something essential has been missing: themselves. This is where the point of no return appears. When an empath chooses self-respect over attachment, it's not a decision made in anger or impulse. It's usually made after years of reflection, disappointment, and internal conflict. They've tried explaining, forgiving, adjusting, and hoping. They've questioned themselves more than anyone else ever questioned them. And then, one day, something clicks. The empath realizes that staying connected to someone who consistently disrespects them requires self-betrayal. Jung believed that individuation demands the courage to face separation. Separation from roles, expectations, and relationships that no longer align with the true self. Once an empath crosses this threshold, they don't go back, because going back would mean undoing awareness. Awareness once gained cannot be unlearned. The empath now sees patterns clearly: how guilt was used to keep them available, how their empathy was mistaken for obligation, how love became conditional on self-erasure. This clarity changes their inner structure. They stop negotiating their boundaries internally. They stop feeling responsible for other people's emotions. Their nervous system begins to calm, not because life is perfect, but because it's finally honest. To those who relied on the empath's overgiving, especially narcissistic personalities, this shift is deeply unsettling. The empath who once explained, reassured, and absorbed emotional chaos is no longer accessible in the same way. They are still kind, but they are no longer flexible at the cost of their dignity. Jung described individuation as a lifelong process, but there are moments within it that act like doors closing behind you. This is one of them. The empath doesn't become detached from humanity, they become attached to their own inner truth. They stop chasing connection and start choosing alignment. This is why the shift feels permanent. It's not a boundary built on anger, it's built on identity. The empath no longer asks, "How do I keep this relationship?" They ask, "Does this relationship reflect who I am becoming?" And if the answer is no, they walk away without needing the other person to understand. That's what makes this phase so frightening to people who benefited from the old version of the empath. There's no argument to win, no emotion to manipulate, no guilt to activate. Individuation removes the empath from familiar roles, rescuer, caretaker, emotional anchor, and places them into self-authorship. Jung believed that many people fear individuation because it requires standing alone psychologically, even while remaining connected to the world. The empath who has individuated can love without losing themselves, can say no without explaining, can leave without hatred. They are no longer driven by fear of abandonment because they have already faced the most difficult separation, the separation from who they thought they had to be. This is not a dramatic transformation, it's a grounded one. The empath doesn't announce their awakening, they simply live differently. Their energy is steadier, their presence is firmer, their silence carries weight. And once this internal alignment is achieved, returning to self-betrayal feels impossible. Jung understood that individuation doesn't make life easier, it makes it truer. For the empath, that truth becomes non-negotiable. They don't go back, not because they are cold or unforgiving, but because they finally know who they are without the constant need to be needed. And that, knowing, changes everything. When an empath finally withdraws emotionally, something profound and unsettling happens on the other side, especially for a narcissist. And this is where Carl Jung offers one of the clearest psychological explanations. Jung believed that the shadow is the part of ourselves we refuse to see, accept, or take responsibility for, and narcissists are particularly skilled at avoiding it. They build their entire identity around control, admiration, and external validation, using other people as mirrors to confirm their importance and worth. As long as someone is reacting to them, arguing, defending, explaining, loving, or even suffering, the narcissist doesn't have to look inward. The empath unknowingly becomes that mirror. Through attention, emotional availability, and constant engagement, the empath provides the narcissist with a sense of existence. But when the empath goes silent, not out of punishment, but out of self-protection, the mirror disappears. There is no argument to dominate, no emotion to provoke, no reassurance to extract. What remains is emptiness. Jung believed this kind of emptiness is one of the greatest psychological threats because it forces a person to confront what they've been running from all along. For the narcissist, silence is not peace, it's exposure. Without the empath's emotional energy, the narcissist is left alone with their own unresolved feelings, shame, insecurity, fear, and a fragile sense of self they've spent years avoiding. This is why empathic withdrawal often triggers panic, rage, or sudden attempts at re-engagement. The narcissist isn't missing the empath as a person, they're missing the regulation the empath provided. Jung understood that many people fear the shadow not because it is evil, but because it reveals truth. And truth threatens the false self the narcissist depends on. When the empath withdraws, the narcissist can no longer project their shadow outward. There is no one left to blame, fix, or manipulate into carrying it for them. The silence becomes a psychological mirror, and what it reflects is unbearable. Meanwhile, the empath experiences something entirely different. The silence feels grounding. It brings clarity, emotional stability, and relief. What once felt like obligation now feels optional. The empath realizes that their constant emotional presence was not love, it was maintenance. Jung believed that real growth requires facing one's inner world without distraction, but narcissists are structured to avoid that at all costs. They rely on noise, drama, and reaction to stay disconnected from themselves. Silence strips away those defenses. That's why emotional withdrawal feels so ruthless to them. It's not because the empath is being cruel, but because the empath is no longer participating in the narcissist's avoidance. The empath isn't attacking, explaining, or demanding accountability. They're simply unavailable. And that unavailability forces the narcissist into a confrontation they cannot control. Jung warned that people who refuse to face their shadow often react destructively when it is exposed. This explains why silence can provoke stronger reactions than confrontation. Anger still feels like engagement. Silence feels like abandonment by the very system that kept the narcissist emotionally afloat. The empath, however, is no longer responsible for managing that reaction. By withdrawing, they reclaim their energy and stop carrying emotional weight that was never theirs. The narcissist may attempt to provoke a response, rewrite the narrative, or seek replacement sources of validation, but the original wound remains. They were seen, and then they were left alone with themselves. Jung believed that wholeness requires responsibility for one's inner life. The empath, by choosing silence, steps into that responsibility for themselves. The narcissist, stripped of external distraction, is left facing the cost of having avoided it. That is why silence is so powerful. It doesn't punish, it doesn't explain, it simply reveals. And for someone who has built their identity on escaping inner truth, that revelation is terrifying. True power, according to Jung, does not come from dominance or force. It comes from wholeness, from balance, and from understanding oneself fully. He believed that we are not complete by being good or by endlessly giving. True psychological strength comes from integrating all parts of ourselves, including the parts that feel difficult, dark, or uncomfortable. For a fed-up empath, this realization is transformative. For years, empaths often define themselves through their emotional availability, their capacity to soothe, understand, and sacrifice for others. They measure their worth by how much they can give, how many crises they can absorb, how deeply they can understand people who may never return the same effort. But over time, this imbalance creates exhaustion and leaves the empath vulnerable to manipulation, especially by narcissistic personalities who thrive on overgiving. Emotional sovereignty is the point at which the empath steps back and recognizes that their energy, attention, and compassion are not obligations, they are choices. It's not about anger, retaliation, or punishment, it's about independence. When an empath claims emotional sovereignty, they stop reacting to manipulations that once would have triggered guilt, anxiety, or over-explanation. They no longer seek validation from those who never offered it. They do not feel the need to justify their boundaries or explain their absence. This is where their ruthlessness is born, not from cruelty, but from self-possession. The power lies in absence, in calmness, in the refusal to engage in cycles that once drained them. Jung argued that balance is the foundation of wholeness, and in claiming emotional sovereignty, the empath restores that balance. Their kindness no longer comes at the cost of self-respect. Their empathy is no longer a tool for others' control. They engage with the world from a place of choice, not compulsion. This independence can be disarming to those accustomed to exploiting their overgiving. Narcissists, who are used to constant emotional supply, are suddenly confronted with a version of the empath who cannot be controlled, who does not react predictably, who does not need approval. That absence of leverage is what makes emotional sovereignty feel ruthless from the outside. For the empath, it feels like relief. They are no longer carrying the emotional weight of someone else's validation. They are fully present in themselves, steady in their boundaries, calm in their detachment, and intentional in their interactions. Jung's insight reminds us that wholeness is not soft, it is balanced. The empath's independence is not about losing compassion, it's about claiming it for themselves first. Emotional sovereignty is not an act of aggression, it is a declaration of self-respect. And once this state is reached, the empath no longer exists as an emotional outlet for others. They exist as a whole, grounded individual. In this way, the true power of the fed-up empath lies in choice, in clarity, and in unwavering self-possession, a strength that narcissists have no tools to undermine.